Thanks everyone for joining us again, or maybe for the first time here today. This is our 10th TEK Talk. We have Phil right here with us today, so I'm really excited. Before we start, as Margaret said, please keep your mics muted. We'll open up for questions and answers after Phil's talk, and then you can either unmute yourself or type your questions in the chat, and we'll read them out to Phil. We are here in Fairbanks, all three of us, so that means we are on the unceded lands of the Lower Haudenosaunee, and that's something to keep in mind, especially with regard to this talk. And Phil is here with us today. He's an avid fat biker. He's also assistant professor of history and Arctic and Northern Studies here at UAF in Fairbanks. He got his PhD from Brandeis University, I'm hoping I say this right, on global histories of energy and environment. And he got his master's from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, which is home of the world famous Larry's Doghouse restaurant. I got that one from Duncan. With this, I'm really grateful that you're joining us here today. And Phil, if you're ready, then I would just hand this over to you. And yeah, that's it for me. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. All right, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Annika, and thank you, Margaret, for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm going to jump right into one of the first stories I'm going to be telling today, and then I'll kind of pull back a little bit and offer some arguments and context before the remainder of my talk. The winds howled as the members of the 1st Combat Intelligence Platoon mushed their dogs through the dark and frigid winter night. The men worked vigorously and persistently to advance their wartime mission throughout the winter of 1944 and 1945. Temperatures reached negative 46 degrees Fahrenheit as the men scouted the tundra, river valleys, and mountain passes between Livengood and Umiat. These men were the vanguard of the first survey of a pipeline corridor from the North Slope to Alaska's interior. More important than their military training was their decades of experience hunting, traveling, and living in Arctic Alaska. Indeed, these men were selected precisely because of their unparalleled expertise and knowledge of northern environments. This was no ordinary mission, and these were no regular GIs. The 1st Combat Intelligence Platoon was comprised of soldiers of the Alaska Territorial Guard, a military reserve force of Alaska Natives during World War II, more commonly known as the Alaska Scouts. Organized in response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the ATG enlisted First Peoples in the defense of the territory of Alaska. Over 6,000 Native volunteers served without pay, defending Alaska's coastline, guarding critical mineral supplies, and resupplying critical transportation corridors. The ATG proved especially valuable in western and northern Alaska, where southern soldiers struggled in the harsh environments, right? And by southern, I don't mean just like, southern US as in Alabama and Mississippi. I mean everything south of Alaska. So on this day, in the winter of 1944, the Alaska Scouts of the 1st Combat Intelligence Platoon were utilizing their traditional ecological knowledge of the land in order to secure American victory during World War II. In early 1943, when Japanese troops were occupying the Aleutian Islands, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt reserved the entire North Slope of Alaska for military petroleum exploration and development in what was called Public Land Order 82. Oil had taken on an unprecedented valence in this new conflict. Quote, "This was a different kind of war, mechanized beyond previous imaginations and requiring almost unbelievable quantities of petroleum products," end quote, explained Navy Commander John C. Reed, who explored for Arctic oil during the war. Alaska's territorial governor, Ernest Greening, was especially enthused at the economic and military prospects of discovering petroleum in the Arctic And he coordinated an exploratory survey spearheaded by the Territorial Department of Mines. And this is a map from that survey in 1943. Groening's survey confirmed that 5 distinct oil flows and suggested the cost of development, including a 600-mile pipeline to Fairbanks, would be feasible. The U.S. Navy shared Groening's enthusiasm, and along with scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, argued that the North Slope offered the best chance of fueling Alaska's future military needs. To this end, the government approved a $2.1 million comprehensive exploration program of the North Slope by the Navy's CB Engineering Unit in 1944. The Navy relied heavily on reports of oil seepages from Inupiaq elders, people like Charles Brower. Enter the Alaska Scouts. Settler Navy personnel struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions of Arctic Alaska. The military and its contractors had little experience operating in the far north, and the extreme environmental conditions of the North Slope constantly stymied their efforts at petroleum development. The Navy had these 25,000-pound tracked vehicles, and they were incessantly getting bogged down in the soggy tundra. And these tank-like vehicles left indelible scars, some reaching as deep as 12 feet in just the first year across hundreds of miles of the tundra. These scars of ecological ignorance still remain today. When it came time to determine the feasibility of a pipeline route between the North Slope and Fairbanks, settler soldiers had to rely on local expertise. Thus, the first ground truthing of a North Slope pipeline was undertaken by members of the Alaska Territorial Guard, as we talked about in the introduction. In the early winter of 1944 and 1945, 3 ATG patrols totaling 8 men spearheaded a survey of the potential pipeline route to Livengood from Umiat on the North Slope. The men of the ATG traveled over 2,000 miles by dog sled in the middle of winter in the Arctic, battling snow as deep as 44 inches and temperatures which reached negative 46 degrees Fahrenheit. They achieved their objective and laid out a feasible route which future petroleum could flow from the North Slope for the nation's military energy needs. So here was a moment when traditional ecological knowledge was indispensable for the American war effort and attempts to produce Arctic petroleum. The vital knowledge gained by the Alaska Scouts was also memorialized in a map by a member of the Army Corps of Engineers named Captain Henry F. Thomas. The map he created of a Barrow to Valdez pipeline system stands as a prescient, if significantly more sprawling, vision of the future Trans-Alaska pipeline system. So you can see on this map here, I mean, this is 20 years before the discovery of Prudhoe Bay, the widespread recognition of where a potential pipeline route would go. And those solid lines on the map are, plans to distribute petroleum by barges up and down the river. So Thomas's map imagined a new colonial infrastructure, helping to transform the so-called wilderness of Alaska's north into a future hydrocarbon province. At the same time, the map worked to dispossess the landscape of its ancestral owners. For decades afterwards, private industry, including the owners of the Trans-Alaska pipeline system, used this native-led survey to advance the construction of an Arctic artery. The contribution of these native soldiers is almost unknown in Alaska today, despite the vital importance of their knowledge for Alaska's contemporary political economy. Following the end of the Second World War, the Alaska Scouts were disbanded. Only around the year 2000 were ATG members granted U.S. veteran status, enabling the dwindling number of survivors to gain access to benefits befitting military service members. Like so often in Alaskan history, settler society utilized native knowledge in pursuit of development, but did not permit natives a seat at the table or an equitable share of profits. Okay, that's my introductory story for you all. So let me focus on what I'm going to talk to you all about today and what I want you to walk away, the arguments I'm going to make in this talk today. So this series asks, how do we, as scientists and scholars, do better research and work with Indigenous peoples as equitable partners in the co-production of scientific knowledge? I argue that scholars must understand the history of this land and its people in order to grapple with enduring legacies of dispossession and colonialism. And I offer this slide to you all here. You may recognize this from the Rasmussen Library, but this is one of the defining moments in the early history of settler colonialism in Alaska. So we need to recognize how history has shaped and continues to shape the institutions, professions, and frameworks within which we operate. We need to recognize that the practice of science was not and is not neutral in this history. As many historians have argued, the production of scientific research and knowledge has long been at the vanguard of processes of development and settler colonialism. Put simply, while science strives for neutrality and universality, like everything else human, it is a practice that is reflective of social norms and values. And scientists have attempted to civilize, to capitalize, and to conserve the far north since at least the late 1800s. One only needs to consider the famous history of the search for the North Pole, which certainly goes long before the 1800s, where explorers and scientists sought not only adventure and scientific knowledge, but to find the world's remaining unclaimed lands in the name of nationalism and capitalist development. They became heroes, in part because they expanded the imperial frontiers of their home countries. Scientific ideas in these early centuries measured Native peoples and Native ecological knowledge against the norms of Euro-American experience, reifying the European experience as superior, all the while extracting vital knowledge from First Peoples. And for scholars who want to learn more about this history, I suggest reading historian Andrew Stoll's Unfreezing the Arctic: Science, Colonialism, and the Transformation of Inuit Lands. And this is the first of 5 different books that I'm going to be recommending throughout this talk if you're interested, to gain a greater understanding about this past and how it informs the present today. So my talk today is going to focus on the years between 1941 and 1971, from World War II to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And part of my temporal focus here is because we only have 45 minutes, right? It's very hard to cover the entire history of Alaska in 45 minutes. So I won't be discussing the longer and deeper history of colonialism in Alaska from the 1700s to the mid-1900s. This history is hugely important, and I discuss it at depth in my History of Alaska class. So if you're interested in this content, I welcome you to take that class, and that's available for both undergrads and grad students. But for those interested in learning more about how Western ideas of science and progress impacted Alaskan development and First Peoples, I highly recommend reading Bathsheba DeMuth's Floating Coast, an environmental history of the Bering Strait. We were fortunate enough to have Bathsheba DeMuth speak earlier this year at UAF, and her recorded talk may still be available to you all. And Floating Coast is an exemplary form of environmental history. I'm an environmental historian by training. It won environmental history's top honor, the George Perkins Marsh Prize. And DeMuth really demonstrates that, we can't understand change over time in the far north if we do not think deeply about native value systems, non-human animals, and distant ideological systems like communism and capitalism that have strived to reorder the ecosystems of the far north. So why are we beginning with World War II here today, other than our temporal constraints? So quite simply, no other single event in Alaskan history since Russian and American colonization had such a profound impact on the territory. During the course of the war, the federal government poured over $1 billion into Alaskan defense and infrastructure, and that's $1 billion in 1940s currency. The torrent of federal dollars, men, and material overshadowed every past resource rush in the territory's history and elevated national interest in the region. So more money was spent during World War II in the territory than all the money earned from the fur trade, from the gold rush, and from the years of the whaling industry in Alaska. It was only during World War II that the population of settlers began to outnumber Alaskan natives. And it was only during World War II that the cash economy and wage labor came to parts of northern and interior Alaska that had never been colonized. As UF historian Terence Cole argued, World War II completely, profoundly, and irrevocably transformed Alaska. I'll also be focusing on infrastructure projects today, and it's useful that this map from the U.S. Army in 1944 is talking about all the different infrastructure projects that were invested in during the war. Famous things that you all know about, like the Alcan Highway, but also significantly less famous projects that most people don't know about, like the Canal pipeline system that provided the petroleum for that pipeline, for that highway, and the airfields of the Northwest staging route. Due to the unique nature of the North, in the post-World War II period, development has most often been advanced in the form of infrastructural mega projects. And there's something unique in the Alaskan experience which has produced this kind of what I call this mega project mentality. Ironically, foundational to many of these resource development projects were the traditional knowledge of First Peoples. Whether it was knowledge of copper deposits in Kennecott, oil deposits on the North Slope, or how to survive harsh Alaskan winters, traditional ecological knowledge proved instrumental in settler colonial societies' attempts to develop the far north. Despite providing this invaluable knowledge, First Peoples were more often than not poorly compensated, politically excluded, and socially marginalized in the transformation of their homelands. And I think it's important not to see this history one as of simple victimization, but one of unequal and shifting power relationships. With time, First Peoples utilized the tools of settler colonial culture and political economy in their fight for self-determination, which we'll be talking about a little later in the lecture today. Indeed, the rise of Native political power and self-determination occurred in direct opposition to a flurry of destructive mega projects proposed in the 1950s and 1960s. Without this historical context, we as scholars and scientists can't begin to understand the historical trauma, antipathy towards Western scientific research, researchers, and practices. Finally, I must note that I offer this history as a Southerner. I was not raised in Alaska. I do not have ancestral ties to Alaska. My father's family were English and German farmers from Western New York, the ancestral lands of the Seneca people. My mother's family were Scottish and English merchants from Massachusetts, specifically the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc people. I was raised on the ancestral lands of the Miami people of Southern Ohio. So today I'm not speaking for anyone else, but offering my view and perspectives as someone who has studied Alaskan history for the past decade. This brings us to the first mega project that I want to talk about today, Project Chariot, which I hope many of you know about, but if you don't, I hope to aid in your understanding of this really pivotal moment in Alaska history. So the exploration of the North Slope of Alaska for petroleum was just one of a flurry of defense projects in post-war Alaska. The territory boomed as a militarized zone and as a government-dominated resource frontier. Alaska witnessed an almost seamless transition from wartime mobilization to Cold War garrison state. And the two conflicts collectively resulted in a profound realignment of the territory's economy. Government employment went from 12% at the beginning of World War II to 53% in 1950. The military boom included major defense projects like the Defense Early Warning Line, or DEW Line, Completed in 1957, the DEW line not only activated a defensive radar perimeter, the construction of these stations brought servicemen, roads, and a steady stream of aircraft to the Arctic. The DEW project, according to two leading historians of the Cold War Arctic, was a, quote, extraordinary intervention that likely did more to alter the lives of northern inhabitants than any other Cold War initiative, end quote. During this period, the federal government also endeavored to deploy military technologies like nuclear weapons to develop during the Second World War for quote unquote peaceful purposes. In the 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, proposed utilizing nuclear weapons for a variety of non-military projects. The head of this effort was Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, seen in this Time magazine article on the left. Teller first attempted to reshape nature through what he called, quote, the great art of geographical engineering. His first attempt was this Project Chariot, an effort to create a deep water harbor along the supposedly barren Arctic coast of northwestern Alaska. The plan proposed a series of nuclear explosions. The first iteration of the plan was something like 6 atomic blasts, each larger than the Hiroshima atomic bomb, to blast at a shipping channel and deep water port to serve as an export terminal for coal mining in the region. Teller in Project Chariot embodied the supreme confidence of many post-war scientists to radically transform the natural world. This high modernist approach to the natural environment extended to any peoples that did not conform with Teller's view of modernity. When Alaskan economist George Rogers asked Teller what would happen to the Inupiaq peoples living near the proposed blast zone, who relied upon hunting and fishing for their living, Teller insisted that Chariot would not let pre-modern peoples stand in the way of progress. Quote, we are not interested in preserving the Eskimo as a hunter, Teller admonished. We are interested in giving him the opportunity to become a coal miner, end quote. Both nature and society were pliable materials to be molded by Teller's atomic weapons in the name of scientific progress. Two major native villages, Point Hope to the north and Kivalina to the south, were within 40 miles of the blast radius. No Inupiaq peoples were consulted and informed when AEC petitioned the Bureau of Land Management to withdraw over 1,600 square miles of ancestral Inupiaq lands for the atomic test. Inupiaq saw their land and their primary means of survival, resilience, and identity being threatened by Project Chariot. Take our land, take our lives, soon became the rallying cry for Alaska's First Peoples. Losing the ability to subsist from the land and move freely throughout their ancestral homelands was an existential threat for Alaska natives, but certainly not the first challenge they had faced from colonialism. Alaska's First Peoples remained marginalized and exploited under US colonialism, but still connected to their ancestral lands and its bounty. Even before any nuclear testing occurred, Project Chariot sent shockwaves throughout Alaska. A letter from the women of Point Hope Village Health Council to President Kennedy emphasized this fear. Quote, all 4 seasons, each month, we get what we need for living. We are concerned about the health of our children and the mothers to be after the explosion, end quote. In November 1961, Inupiaq leaders called a Petiot, or People's Heritage, a political meeting in Utiavik to organize against Project Chariot. Participants converged on Utiavik from 17 different villages, none of which had telephones or newspapers. This was, quote, a beautiful experience, one Inupiaq recalled. Quote, when the participants began to realize that their problems were generally the same, end quote. Perhaps the most important outcome of the Petiot was the creation of a statewide newspaper for informing, uniting, and activating Alaska's First Peoples. No such organ had ever existed. An Inupiaq from Point Hope named Howard Rock created the Tundra Times in the winter of 1962. Rock used his voice and the circulation of the paper to call for the First Peoples of Alaska to legally claim their ancestral lands. And by legally claim, I mean like legally within, settler legal systems that see land as something where you need a formal title in order to own it, rather than ancestral modes of, living with and living on the land. The Tundra Times proved to be an invaluable communication medium for the natives throughout Alaska as they debated, organized, and fought for their civil rights. And, the two books I would highly recommend to read in this regard, Dan O'Neill's The Firecracker Boys. I'll be talking a little bit more about this book here in a moment. And if you're interested in learning more about Howard Rock and the Tundra Times, I highly recommend Art and Eskimo Power by Lael Morgan. So in pursuit of gaining greater public support for this project, the Atomic Energy Commission agreed in early 1959 to a series of health and safety studies in conjunction with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The University of Alaska's, at that time, it was just the University of Alaska, right? There was not competition from down south. The University of Alaska's new president, William Wood, namesake of the Wood Center, was an outspoken supporter of Project Chariot. He said, quote, "If the United States government decides that the project is a safe one, there is no reason for concern," end quote. As the picture of environmental destruction became more clear with these bioenvironmental surveys, UAF scientists became opposed to the project and more outspoken about its harm. So there's this clear disjuncture between UAF leadership and the scientists who were conducting this research. As Alaskan historian Dan O'Neill documented, these biologists became key allies of the Inupiat and environmentalist foes of Project Chariot. Their field research revealed that the local Inupiat hunted and fished extensively in the proposed blast zone. Perhaps most importantly, the team proved that radioactive fallout would contaminate lichens in the region, as the caribou consumed the lichens and the natives consumed the caribou at a rate of about 200 pounds per person per year. The carcinogenic radionuclides would cause untold physical harm to these peoples. The project's innovative environmental impact assessment revealed stunning ecological interconnections that underscored the lasting effects of nuclear testing. The concerns of these scientists and their findings were suppressed by the Atomic Energy Commission. After these scientists formally complained to the AEC, the biologists sought President Wood's help at the University of Alaska. Instead of intervening on behalf of his faculty, Wood let it be known that he opposed any attempts by the scientists to set the record straight, which he later characterized as negative opposition. There was no tenure at the University of Alaska then, and President Wood ensured that the contracts of the two most vocal Chariot critics, William Pruitt and Les Varick, were not renewed. He effectively fired them. Wood ensured that Pruitt and Varick were blacklisted from getting any jobs at other American universities as well. Yet the commitment of these scientists to truth and objectivity ultimately prevailed. By 1962, Chariot was effectively dead. The project had attracted enormous opposition from First Peoples, an emerging Alaska conservation community, as well as citizens across the lower 48. The science conducted by these researchers made clear the enormous dangers of this project. The defeat of Chariot was the first defeat of the American nuclear establishment in the post-war era, and a pivotal moment in the rise of the American environmental movement. And in fact, Chariot's bioenvironmental surveys were really the first environmental impact assessment, which would be codified into law with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, in 1969. And as many of you well know, is part and parcel of, is an integral part of how we conduct scientific research and trying to understand environmental effects today. Perhaps most importantly, Chariot precipitated nothing less than a native political revolution. First Peoples were now increasingly organized and assertive of their land rights. But despite the defeat of Project Chariot and rising native political consciousness, threats to indigenous lands were multiplying. For many settler Alaskans, hydroelectric power represented the pinnacle of progress and modern development. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government sponsored a flurry of dam construction projects that brought electricity to rural regions, employed tens of thousands of people, and fueled American industrial production during the Second World War. Just listen to some Woody Guthrie songs about this if you want to, hear more about dam construction in the war. In 1954, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began feasibility studies for constructing a large hydroelectric dam along the Yukon River, the last great American river that flowed freely from its headwaters to the ocean. The engineers selected Rampart Canyon, a 100-mile-long gorge just downstream of Yukon Flats, as a quote-unquote natural dam site that could accommodate a gargantuan dam, twice the size of the nation's largest, Grand Coulee on the Columbia River. And when I say natural dam site, their hydraulic engineers loved these high cliffs and these canyons that were formed. And, we can go all the way back to the debate around damming Hetch Hetchy in California, Sierra Nevada mountains in current day Yosemite National Park to understand how engineers kind of looked at the natural landscape and kind of envisioned these infrastructure projects fitting into them. And Hetch Hetchy is really where America's first fight against hydroelectric dams really began. Many of the dam's proponents, the Rampart Canyon Dam's proponents, were well-meaning progressives. They cited the Scandinavian experience with hydro dams as evidence that Alaska could attract a variety of industries, thereby creating jobs and economic development. Alaska Territorial Governor Ernest Greening, who has been called Alaska's greatest governor by UAF historian Klaus Naske, strongly favored the Rampart Dam project. And I should note this to you all, I'm sitting in the Ernest Greening building giving you this lecture, right? When he became one of Alaska's first senators in 1959, Greening secured a $50,000 grant for feasibility studies for the dam. Greening was a huge advocate of the project and saw little downside, describing Yukon Flats as, quote, nothing but a vast wasteland, notable chiefly for swarming clouds of mosquitoes, end quote. Other notable boosters of the project included UAF President William Wood, who served as vice president of the organization which promoted Rampart Dam, called Yukon Power for America. When campaigning for the presidency in Alaska in 1960, John F. Kennedy also advocated for the dam. JFK reminded his audience that the Soviet Union was constructing hydro dams in Siberia, larger than any in the US, and that the Soviet Union wanted to, quote, crush the United States. Kennedy told his Alaskan audience, quote, I see another Alaska, the Alaska of the future. I see a land of over 1 million people. I see the greatest dam in the free world at Rampart Canyon, producing twice the power of the Tennessee Valley Authority to light homes and mills and cities and farms all over Alaska, end quote. So hydroelectricity in general, and Rampart in particular, was widely seen by development experts as the best basis for a secure economy in Alaska. Before oil, development, boosters of Alaska and the Alaska economy really put their money behind hydroelectric development. And as many of you know today, attempts to construct large dams are still with us to this day. And I bring up this point about progressives and hydroelectricity in Scandinavia to really emphasize that we may think it's easy from our vantage point today to cast these people as easy villains, right? It almost seems cartoonish in terms of the harm that would be done by a lot of these schemes. But we must also understand these events in the context of the era. The Rampart Dam would have provided renewable energy to encourage the development of Alaska and provide good jobs for thousands of Alaskans. We may not be so reliant upon coal today in Alaska's interior if some of these dam projects had been built, right? So ultimately, we must, as historian E.P. Thompson warned, be cognizant of what he called the enormous condescension of posterity. This notion that the values that we hold today will almost certainly be viewed differently by future generations. So despite the best intentions of dam proponents, local peoples were not consulted in the planning of this dam. The dam would flood the Yukon Flats, an area 200 miles long and between 40 and 90 miles wide, creating a reservoir with a surface area greater than that of Lake Erie. This would flood 7 native villages and displace over 1,200 people. George Sundberg, a delegate to the Alaska Constitutional Convention and prolific writer, dismissed the value of the area by saying it contained, quote, no more than 10 flush toilets, end quote. He issued a challenge to his audience, quote, search the whole world over and it would be difficult to find an equivalent area with so little to be lost through flooding. In fact, those who know it best say the kindest and best thing one could do for the place is put it under 400 feet of water, end quote. This was the prevailing sentiment and ideology amongst a certain class of Alaskan development experts in the 1950s and 60s. Sundberg did not think much of native lifeways and did not believe that they were worth preserving. He claimed that resettlement and job opportunities created in construction would improve displaced residents' standard of living tremendously. At Fort Yukon, Gwich'in peoples denounced the project as a threat to their way of life and organized Gwich'in Ginki, or Yukon Flats people speak, to fight for their land and their culture. Don Young, who was then a local school teacher in Fort Yukon, launched his political career, supported by Yukon Flats People Speak, by denouncing the Rampart Dam and its effects on Fort Yukon. And he is still alive and with us today as our only representative since, 1974? So by the end of 1964, a survey by the Tundra Times communicated how Alaskan natives living in the area really felt. Every village in the Yukon Flats and nearly all downstream were opposed to the mega dam. Senator Greening dismissed petitions he received from native residents of Fort Yukon opposing the dam. He dismissed those as forgeries. Native opponents to the dam were aided by an article in The Atlantic entitled, quote, The Plot to Drown Alaska, which offered an influential summary of the case against Rampart. And there's, as you can imagine, tremendous ecological implications to this as well. And I won't go too deep into this, but if you want to learn more about it, ironically, the single best book to find that in is The Transalaska Pipeline Controversy, a wonderful book with a terrible title. It's not really about the Transalaska Pipeline Controversy. It's about the history of development projects and the frontier worldview in Alaska, especially between 1900 and 1970. So in the final analysis, the economics of Rampart Dam proved prohibitive in its ultimate downfall. One government study of the project concluded Rampart would be, quote, the most expensive gamble ever suggested in hydroelectric development, end quote. So by June 1967, the Department of the Interior recommended against Rampart. And the protest of Alaska Natives certainly played a role in the decision not to build the dam, but arguably the dam had an even more important influence in terms of galvanizing and mobilizing First Peoples to fight for their ancestral lands. So along with Project Chariot, Rampart Dam was among the first major challenges to the integrity of Alaskan Native cultures in the interior. And despite claiming to be interested in the best interests of local peoples, the project planners behind Rampart did not consult the Gwich'in of Yukon Flats and often dismissed their concerns. The Rampart Dam was but one of a flurry of built and unbuilt infrastructure projects in the post-World War II era that has left a lasting legacy of colonialism in Alaska. And I want to, just put a fine point on that. Simply because these projects don't get built does not mean that they don't leave a lasting legacy of trauma. And there's a great concept here by a colleague of mine by the name of Jonathan Payton, who's written a book called Unbuilt Environments. And it's all about how, even things that don't get built can have these tremendous consequences that ripple through time. So this brings us to the final chapter I want to talk about. The discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay and the Transalaska pipeline system. For the Inupiat of the North Slope, following the cancellation of Chariot, The greatest threat to their sovereignty and lifeways were the international oil firms that had begun scouring the North Slope for petroleum in the late 1950s. As Richfield and other oil firms began exploratory drilling throughout the North Slope, their frenzied industrial activity and invasion of Inupiat sovereignty alarmed one of the most pivotal and charismatic actors of the native rights revolution, a young man by the name of Charles Edwardson Jr., or Etok. Born in Utqiagvik on October 5th, 1943, Etok grew up learning both traditional Inupiat customs and modern American culture from the scientists at the recently established Arctic Naval Research Laboratory. And this was a laboratory that was actually established because the military had so much trouble with permafrost during World War II, and they needed to figure out how to drill for oil. So that's one of the reasons the Navy's lab came about in the late 40s and early 50s. So back to Etok. While a student at Alaska's Bureau of Indian Affairs School in Sitka, Etok first read historian Herbert Howe Bancroft's History of Alaska, and the book awakened him to the dark and hidden history of Alaska. Bancroft argued that Russians found it cheaper to sell Alaska to the United States than conquer the natives. Through Bancroft's work, Etok learned that Inupiat were never defeated, and Alaska natives never relinquished legal title to their lands. A gentle but brilliant, but fiercely passionate and obsessive man, according to his biographer, Etok soon devoted his life to the singular cause of native rights. Inspired by the Great Barrow Duck Inn of 1961, where hundreds of Inupiat hunters collectively protested the prosecution of traditional hunting practices by breaking the law openly, Etok believed it was time for Alaskan natives throughout the North Slope to band together and demand their rights. If the people can do this for ducks, he reasoned, we can sure do it for our land. Etok believed collective action was essential because their ancestral lands were, quote, being exploited for oil and other minerals by the state and federal governments and also by private agencies, end quote. Etok had a premonition, in the early 1960s that a large oil field would be found on the North Slope. In 1965, Etok wrote letters to each village council throughout the North Slope and proposed creating the Arctic Slope Native Association, or ASNA, to assert legal ownership to their ancestral lands. Village leaders throughout the North Slope responded with enthusiasm and a strong pledge of support. 100 participants and their representatives soon met in Utqiagvik and voted to create ASNA. Soon after, the Native Association claimed Aboriginal title to the entire North Slope, the largest blanket land claim in U.S. history. The timing of the creation of ASNA and their land claim proved fortuitous. In the midst of this Native political revolution, in 1968, Arco and Humboldt, soon to be renamed Exxon, discovered Prudhoe Bay, the largest conventional oil field in North America on Inupiat ancestral lands. Only months later, the firms quickly decided that they would construct a pipeline from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. British Petroleum, Arco, and Exxon, what would become known as the Big Three in Alaska, did not consult the federal government, the state of Alaska, or Alaska natives before committing to the design, timing, and route of the pipeline system. The speed and hubris behind these consequential decisions ultimately collided with an increasingly assertive native justice movement and a public alarmed by the nation's epidemic of pollution. By the summer of 1969, following the nation's worst oil spill at Santa Barbara, the nation was in the midst of what Secretary of the Interior Wally Hickel called an environmental revolution. So we have a map, this is from National Geographic in 1971, thinking about what this pipeline route would look like. And I like the perspective of this. And you can also see there was a corollary, an alternative proposed pipeline, the Trans-Canada pipeline, that would have cut across the North Slope of Alaska and gone down through Canada. So today we see grassroots fights by First Peoples and environmentalists against pipelines like Dakota Access, Keystone XL, Enbridge Line 3, and the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. But the continent's first major pipeline fight was in Alaska. The proposed Transalaska pipeline system was the nation's most contested infrastructure project in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This fight intensified when some of the biggest oil companies in the world tried to dispossess indigenous lands from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. The oil companies promised the Chugach natives of Prince William Sound and Athabascans of the interior jobs and money in exchange for a pipeline right-of-way to cross their ancestral lands. But the oil companies misled the villages, and they had little intention of hiring native firms. So 5 Athabascan villages sued the federal government in court to stop the pipeline from crossing their lands. And on April 1st, 1970, they won in court. Only days later, in a separate lawsuit, a judge issued an injunction against the entire pipeline project until the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 were approved. The Alaska pipeline was dead in its tracks, thanks to the 1-2 punch of native self-determination and environmental activism. The oil firms' haste to construct an 800-mile pipeline across the Alaskan wilderness brought native claims from the fringes of Alaskan politics to the center of power in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, this became one of the most important things that needed to be settled so that the largest private capital project in human history could be constructed. The oil companies, the state of Alaska, and the Nixon administration all redoubled their efforts. In order to realize their lucrative pipeline, the Big Three spurred the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, in 1971. ANCSA began the actual text of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act begins by declaring that, quote, there is an immediate need for a fair and just settlement of all land claims by Native and Native groups in Alaska, end quote. This immediate need, of course, had everything to do with the pipeline and very little to do with centuries of injustice wrought upon Alaska's first people. ANCSA was arguably the single most consequential decision in Alaska since the territory's purchase from Russia in 1867. Quote, virtually every aspect of Alaska's history since 1971, historian Stephen Haycox points out, has been framed and influenced by the act. Alaska Governor Jay Hammond told the US Senate in 1975 that ANCSA, quote, was and is the single most important decision in Alaskan affairs since Alaska's purchase from Russia in 1867, end quote. Ultimately, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act raised innumerable questions and left a sense of bewilderment and unease throughout rural Alaska. The act did not legally ensure that land title for, did not actually legally ensure the land title for Alaska natives, since shares to native corporations could be sold to non-natives, and did not ensure their right to hunt, fish, and collect sustainable resources from the land. Those issues would have to be litigated later on in ANILCA in 1980, as well as amendments that were made to ANCSA later. So ultimately, in conclusion, ANCSA did not settle much, except for incorporating First Peoples and ensuring a clean legal land title for the Alaska pipeline and the Prudhoe Bay oil development to succeed. So I'll leave it there on that note to encapsulate this portion of history and turn it over to Margaret and Annika for the questions section. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was an amazing presentation, and I'm opening up to questions.
Oh, I'll leave you all with this cartoon talking about ANCSA.
You can just raise your hand or type it in the chat or unmute. And if you're on the phone, it's *6 to unmute. Well, I ask because I think, our goal was to provide this historical perspective and to root it in that. What would you say, kind of reflecting on what's happening now and with current events with research, how does that kind of relate?
So, I mean, there's a lot of different parallels that we could go into here. And I guess, one of the main things that I wanted to do with this talk was really to provide that historical background because, if you're a scientist or a researcher in Alaska today, I think it's easy to go into villages and not really understand the deep histories of colonialism and the real legacies of these projects, again, built and unbuilt, right? Just because a project didn't succeed doesn't mean it did not leave a lasting amount of damage. And so having even an elementary understanding of this history and the complexities of the past, right? I think it's important that we understand the complex historical contexts that are going on here. Even having an elementary understanding of that can be hugely helpful, because going to some of these places or talking to different folks on the ground, trying to think of the best way to put this. It is so important to go in with an attitude of respect and humility. And I think understanding this history gives you more of that sense of humility.
Thank you. Adelaide, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, Phil, in that map you had the Alaska projects 1941 to 1944. I thought you said something about Army, but maybe you meant all military. Some of those villages I see, I was wondering, were there military sites there, or what exactly is that? Like, I see one at Naknek, there was King Salmon Air Force Base there, but the ones further down, like Fort Morrow, Fort Randall, and those are, can you tell me more about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, really throughout World War II, there were military bases all throughout Alaska. And you're absolutely right. It wasn't just Army, even though a lot of these were airfields. And during World War II, it was the Army Air Force, right? So those were under the jurisdiction of the Army. But we've got to remember, one of the few U.S. territories actually invaded during the war, the only part of continental North America that was invaded in World War II were the Aleutian Islands. And so a lot of those projects that were constructed down the, throughout the Aleutian Islands were in direct reaction to the Japanese invasions of Attu and Kiska, and were creating these bases to repel the Japanese. And I guess a couple things to note about this. I mean, there was enormous levels of sacrifice from Alaska Natives all throughout the war, and this happened in really in kind of contradictory ways, right? So one way I talked about the Alaska Territorial Guard, thousands and thousands of people who volunteered to help defend Alaska against the Japanese invasion, but at the same time, the U.S. military was deporting Unanagan people from the Aleutians into internment camps. The amount of suffering that took place because of the deportation of those peoples. And of course, the military claimed, oh, we're doing this to protect you. But then they got moved to camps, many of them outside of Juneau, in really terrible and reprehensible conditions. And so World War II really profoundly impacted rural Alaska, not only during the war because of the dispossession of those people, but also the construction of these infrastructures, which endured well into the post-war years, as again, there was a seamless transition from World War II, the efforts of World War II into the Cold War economy. And, there's a lot of toxic legacies of those sites. If you think about what's required for military warfare, whether it's petroleum or gunpowder, all of these things have left literally toxic legacies from Galena to the Aleutians all throughout Alaska.
Thanks. We had a question come in the chat on whether there are any courses you teach that kind of cover similar topics that you get presented on. And someone answered for you about the history of Alaska. I'm not sure if you have any other courses.
Sure. Yeah, History Alaska would be the main one that really focuses on this. The other thing is understanding these events within a circumpolar perspective. Because if you look at, the Native political rights revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, this is happening concurrent with global decolonization efforts that are happening all throughout the world, and especially throughout the circumpolar north with First Peoples in Canada, the Sami peoples in Scandinavia. So the other course I'd recommend is Arctic and Northern Studies 483 and 683, which is 20th century history of the circumpolar North. And we've got I'm teaching that right now, and there's a bunch of grad students in that class, and we really delve into these issues in depth.
Thanks. So we have a couple minutes left. So we are adding another tech talk about allyship, a panel right after spring break. I also put an evaluation link in the chat, just for those people that have to take off at the top of the hour, but we might hang out to do a couple more questions. So, oh, good, someone put it in the chat. Oh, okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, and I see Victoria also wrote Perspectives of the North here. That's a great class. I would also plug classes by my colleague, Dr. Tyler Kirk, who teaches about the history of Russia, because these issues are certainly not unique to Alaska and are happening all throughout the circumpolar North.
All right. So, here comes another question. What efforts, if any, has the university made towards reparations to Alaska Natives for their role in this history?
That is a great question, Linda. And I have not studied this comprehensively, and I have not been teaching at UAF that long. So I would hazard to offer a comprehensive answer to that question. But I guess I would say, one of the things they're doing is I feel like the university has not necessarily shied away from this history, right? I think the history of Chariot is fairly well known throughout university faculty and personnel today. Certainly, there's a lot more that could be done. One thing, and this does not go towards reparations to Alaska Natives, but goes towards an acknowledgement of some of the harm that happened and recognizing the narrative of this, which is UAF did offer honorary doctorates to William Pruitt and Les Varick for basically being summarily dismissed for being good scientists, for actually advocating their research. Apparently it was the only, back in those days, it was the only graduation that William Wood did not attend, was when they were given those awards. The other thing is this year, UAF is honoring Dan O'Neill for his contribution of bringing that story forth in the Firecracker Boys. And if I could recommend just one book to all of you guys, it would be the Firecracker Boys, because the history that's told there is so important. But, to really answer your question, Linda, I would say we as a university community have a significant amount of work to be done in order to confront this history and figure out what needs to be done in order to make that make those past injustices right.
And to add to this, our second speaker, I think Kari Eriksson, mentioned Project Chariot and that there has been no apology from UAF to the people living there. So UAF has a long way to go, I think, in that specific regard. Yep.
Hey, Phil, I had a quick question. This is Matt von Lintig.
Hey, Matt. Yeah, go ahead.
Great talk. You give a really nice perspective. I was wondering if you kind of knew much about, so like with the climate uncertainty in the future of Alaska and kind of the current land deeds or whatever's going on with the natives and how that land is appropriated to them. Do you see many or what would be like a resolution to kind of the changing, like caribou herd movement and just kind of the change in resources that these native peoples use, and now we're kind of telling them that they have settled in a spot and they're allocated that portion.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So, all throughout Alaska, especially Western Alaska, we have villages who are acutely impacted by climate change, right? I don't need to tell this group that you all understand this, whether that's Shishmaref, or whether it's, communities in the YK Delta who are experiencing flooding, who are experiencing erosion. And part of the problem is that a lot of these communities are not where these are permanent communities that have been created only recently in modern history, and they were created in those spots because of colonial interventions. So sometimes that was a boarding school being set up, other times it was a post office being establishment, and the role of especially the federal government in terms of solidifying where those communities were, has resulted in the modern communities that we know today. And very often those locations would be selected on places where folks had been congregating in the summer. Well, where people are in the summer is not where they want to like shelter from harsh winter storms, right? And so we need to face up to this real kind of colonial legacy that a lot of these villages were incentivized to be built where they were by the federal government, and now they have tremendous costs as the climate is changing, and as some of them are literally falling into the ocean. And so it's a great question, Matt. It's complicated on a number of different levels. I know CCHRC is doing a lot of good work, the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, to help try to provide housing for some of these communities. But I think the big picture is that the federal government has an obligation to these people to assist them and fund their relocation because of their history, setting up these communities where they did.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. This is really complicated. We could probably spend like multiple lectures just talking about this. There's tons of great experts here at UAF. I do not claim to be an expert on the subject, but just from that historical perspective, we can understand that throwing our hands up and saying, oh, well, it's the fault of these people is historically ignorant and really mistaken.
So we have a lengthy question, part question coming in. Can you point to any attempts from proposals of new Arctic infrastructure projects to avoid retreading the same trends that you highlighted today? In particular, I'm thinking about the proposed deep water port in Nome or Arctic shipping infrastructure throughout the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Are these really being approached with greater community input and collaboration?
Great question, Mike. Right, and very practical to what we're facing today. And I don't think I have a simple or a comprehensive answer to that question. And part of that is because as much as I try to pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the present, I am a historian. I guess what I would say about that is, based on what I see out there today, it's really varied. Right. I'm not sure about the Nome Port project, how much local, consideration and how many avenues for local consultation have been provided there. The project that immediately comes to mind for me is the Amboy Road project, right? And you've had a lot of local peoples, certainly not universally, but a lot of local peoples, south of the Brooks Range, opposed to that road development. But because of the political economic interests of the state, right, we go to Ada and what's going on with Ada, those people are not necessarily being listened to, right? And so that's a project where you can really feel the weight of the history and feel history repeating itself. And it's, I guess I would just underscore that there is this big disjuncture between the state's desire for economic development and this notion that in order to quote unquote create good jobs, we need to blaze roads into places, we need to build these infrastructures, versus the beliefs of a lot of local and First Peoples, right? And I don't, the opinions of those people are not monolithic, right? There's folks who do support, various forms of development, but it's that basic lack of consultation or the lack of actually listening to what people are saying in that consultation that I think there are projects today that are repeating those mistakes of the past. And some of this comes down to, you know, how do we make sure that we don't repeat these mistakes? I wish I had more time today, really underscoring the difference in worldviews and the difference in values approaching the natural environment that are embedded in either, you know, resource development and infrastructure projects versus you know, the values of First Peoples and local residents who want to maintain their way of life.
Thanks. Kind of refocusing back to you, yeah, there's two comments earlier. One was about how probably not new faculty nor students really know kind of the history with UAF and like Project Chariot, as well as UAF or the UA Wight is looking to get more land as part of being a land grant university. I don't know if you, there with comments, I don't know if you wanted to comment to that or not.
Yeah, that's, I guess all I'd say about that is this is part of a larger national conversation that's going on in this country right now about what obligations do land grant institutions have to the original owners of that land, the ancestral owners of that land. Cornell University just had a big commission to look into what type of reparations might be paid to the First Peoples whose land that Cornell is on. I'm not particularly familiar with what's going on with university lands today in current proposals, so I don't want to speculate on that. But I would just say that, you know, this is a conversation that extends well beyond Alaska, and I think it's an important national context for us to pay attention to and see what other universities are doing in order to you know, maintain their mantle as, you know, trying to be these places of academic knowledge and stewardship for the environment, right? Universities say that they claim about those things. All right, the proof is in the pudding. What are you going to do?
Any last questions? I don't know if Annika, you got any?
No, I didn't see more questions in the chat.
Okay. So I think I'll end the presentation or end the recording now. So thank you, Phil.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate the invite.